The farthest a human being has ever traveled from Earth is exactly 400,171 kilometers. That distance was reached by the crew of Apollo 13 in April 1970, when their damaged spacecraft swung around the far side of the Moon. But that record isn't just a historical footnote. It represents a hard boundary defined not by ambition or technology, but by the physical limits of the human body itself. We know this because every astronaut who has ventured beyond low Earth orbit has experienced measurable, documented changes to their physiology. Changes that began within hours and accelerated with distance and time. These aren't theoretical risks. They are recorded in medical data, bone density scans, cardiovascular measurements, and radiation dosimeters carried on every mission beyond Earth's protective magnetosphere. The Apollo astronauts, the only humans to have left low Earth orbit, absorbed between 1.6 and 11.4 millisieverts of radiation during their lunar missions, measured directly by dosimeters worn on their bodies. Those missions lasted between 6 and 12 days. The radiation exposure per day in deep space, beyond the Van Allen belts, is approximately 50 to 100 times higher than what astronauts experience aboard the International Space Station. This isn't speculation. It's the difference between being inside Earth's magnetic shield and being outside it, a difference measured by every instrument that has made the journey. If you enjoy this kind of evidence-based content, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. There are many other videos on the channel built the same way, and if this topic interests you, you'll likely enjoy what's already there. The question of how far the human body can endure in space isn't about courage or engineering. It's about biology confronting an environment that every cell in our body evolved to avoid. And the answer is written in the data we've already collected. To understand the maximum distance, we must first understand what happens to the body the moment it leaves Earth's protection. The International Space Station orbits at an altitude of approximately 400 kilometers. At that height, it remains inside the outer edge of Earth's magnetosphere, a vast magnetic bubble that deflects most of the charged particles streaming from the Sun. Astronauts aboard the ISS are exposed to an average of 150 millisieverts of radiation per year, roughly 50 times the dose received by someone on the ground. That exposure is measurable, trackable, and considered manageable for missions lasting 6 months to 1 year. But the moment a spacecraft climbs beyond roughly 60,000 kilometers, it exits the magnetosphere entirely. The protection vanishes. Cosmic radiation, which consists of high-energy protons and heavier atomic nuclei traveling at near-light speeds, strikes the body continuously. These particles originate from supernova explosions, distant galaxies, and the Sun itself. They penetrate spacecraft hulls, pass through tissue, and collide with the atoms inside cells. When a high-energy proton strikes a strand of DNA, it doesn't just damage it. It shatters it into fragments that the cell's repair mechanisms often cannot reassemble correctly. We know the rate of this damage because it has been measured. During the Apollo missions, astronauts reported seeing flashes of light even when their eyes were closed. These were not hallucinations. They were Cherenkov radiation events caused by cosmic ray particles passing directly through the vitreous fluid of the eyeball at speeds exceeding the speed of light in that medium. The flashes were documented by multiple crew members independently and later reproduced in controlled experiments using particle accelerators. Each flash represented a single high-energy particle traversing the eye. The frequency of these flashes, several per minute in deep space, gives us a direct measurement of the particle flux impacting the body. The biological consequence is cumulative. Radiation damage to DNA increases the probability of cancer, but it also affects cells that do not divide, particularly neurons. Studies of mice exposed to simulated deep space radiation levels have shown permanent deficits in memory and decision-making ability. These are not temporary effects. The damage to neural pathways persists because mature neurons do not regenerate. Human data is more limited, but cognitive testing of Apollo astronauts decades after their missions has revealed a statistically significant increase in cardiovascular disease compared to astronauts who remained in low Earth orbit. The mechanism is understood. Radiation accelerates atherosclerosis by damaging the endothelial cells lining blood vessels. The current NASA limit for astronaut career radiation exposure is 1 sievert, the dose at which the increased lifetime risk of fatal cancer reaches 3%. A round trip to Mars, lasting roughly 2.5 years, would expose astronauts to an estimated 0.7 sieverts, assuming no major solar events. That figure comes from measurements taken by the Radiation Assessment Detector aboard the Curiosity rover during its 8-month transit to Mars. The instrument recorded the actual flux of particles a human body would encounter on that trajectory. The conclusion is clear. A Mars mission would consume most or all of an astronaut's allowable lifetime dose in a single journey. But radiation is not the only constraint. It is not even the most immediate one. Within minutes of entering microgravity, the human body begins to redistribute its fluids. On Earth, gravity pulls blood and other fluids toward the legs. The cardiovascular system compensates by maintaining higher pressure in the lower body and using valves in the veins to prevent backflow. In weightlessness, this system suddenly has no opposition. Blood surges upward into the chest and head. The heart, detecting an apparent increase in blood volume, responds by producing less of the hormone that retains water. The kidneys increase urine output. Within the first day, astronauts lose approximately 1 to 2 liters of fluid, roughly 10 to 15% of their total blood volume. This fluid shift has immediate and measurable effects. The face becomes puffy. The nasal passages swell, creating a sensation of constant congestion. Intracranial pressure rises. Studies using MRI scans of astronauts before and after long-duration spaceflights have revealed flattening of the posterior eyeball, swelling of the optic nerve, and changes to the shape of the pituitary gland. These are not subtle effects. In some cases, astronauts have experienced measurable degradation of visual acuity that persisted months after returning to Earth. The condition is called spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, and it is documented in approximately 40% of astronauts who spend more than 6 months in space. The mechanism is well understood. Increased intracranial pressure physically deforms the eye. The optic nerve, which passes through a bony canal in the skull, becomes compressed. Cerebrospinal fluid, which normally drains from the skull, accumulates because the usual gravity-driven flow is absent. The body has no evolutionary adaptation to manage fluid distribution in the absence of gravity because no organism on Earth has ever needed one. But the cardiovascular changes extend beyond fluid shifts. The heart itself begins to atrophy. On Earth, the heart must generate enough pressure to pump blood upward against gravity, a task that requires continuous muscular effort. In microgravity, that effort is unnecessary. The heart, like any muscle subjected to reduced workload, weakens. Studies of astronauts on the ISS have measured a decrease in left ventricular mass of approximately 10% after 6 months. This is the same chamber responsible for pumping oxygenated blood to the entire body. The reduction is reversible upon return to Earth, but it represents a functional decline that worsens with time. Simultaneously, the blood vessels themselves change. The endothelial cells lining the arteries, which regulate blood flow by contracting and relaxing, lose their responsiveness. Ground-based studies simulating microgravity through extended bed rest have shown that arterial stiffness increases significantly within weeks. Stiffer arteries mean higher blood pressure is required to circulate blood, yet the heart is simultaneously weakening. The result is a mismatch that becomes more pronounced the longer a person remains in space. Upon returning to gravity after a long mission, astronauts experience orthostatic intolerance, the inability to stand without fainting. This is not a minor inconvenience. It is a physiological failure of the system that regulates blood pressure in response to posture. The baroreceptors, sensors in the carotid arteries and aorta that detect pressure changes, become less sensitive in microgravity. When an astronaut stands up after landing, these sensors fail to trigger the normal compensatory increase in heart rate and vascular constriction. Blood pools in the legs, the brain is starved of oxygen, and consciousness is lost. Every astronaut who returns from a spaceflight lasting more than a month requires assistance to walk immediately after landing. Some require days to regain normal function. The question is not whether these changes occur. It is whether they impose a ceiling on mission duration, and therefore on distance. If the cardiovascular system continues to decline, there must be a point beyond which recovery is no longer possible. We do not yet know where that point is because no human has been in continuous microgravity for more than 14 months, the record set by cosmonaut Valery Polyakov aboard the Mir space station in 1995. Polyakov returned to Earth weakened but functional. His recovery took months, but it was complete. However, his mission was conducted in low Earth orbit, where evacuation to Earth is possible within hours. A mission to Mars or beyond eliminates that option. The cardiovascular system operates on feedback mechanisms that evolved under constant gravitational load. Remove that load, and the system recalibrates to a new baseline, one optimized for weightlessness but catastrophically unsuited for gravity. The longer an astronaut remains in space, the more deeply entrenched this recalibration becomes. The heart shrinks not just in muscle mass but in chamber volume. The stroke volume, the amount of blood pumped with each beat, decreases. The maximum heart rate during exercise declines. These are not adjustments that reverse overnight. They require weeks or months of reconditioning, and even then, full recovery is not guaranteed. Data from astronauts who have flown multiple long-duration missions show that the cardiovascular system does not return to its original baseline between flights. Each mission leaves a residual deficit. The cumulative effect suggests that there may be a lifetime limit to how much time a human can spend in microgravity before permanent damage occurs. That limit has not been reached yet, but the trend in the data is clear. The skeletal system deteriorates even faster. Bone is not a static structure. It is living tissue that continuously remodels itself in response to mechanical stress. On Earth, every step, every movement against gravity, generates tiny electrical signals within bone tissue. These signals, produced by the piezoelectric properties of collagen fibers, stimulate cells called osteoblasts to deposit new bone mineral. At the same time, other cells called osteoclasts break down old bone. The balance between these processes maintains bone density. In microgravity, the mechanical stress vanishes. The bones receive no signal to rebuild. Osteoblasts reduce their activity, but osteoclasts continue to work. The result is a net loss of bone mass at a rate of approximately 1 to 2% per month, concentrated in the load-bearing bones of the legs, hips, and spine. This rate has been measured precisely using dual-energy X-ray absorptiometry scans of astronauts before and after spaceflight. 1 to 2% per month may sound gradual, but it is not. After 6 months, an astronaut can lose 12% of their hip bone density, equivalent to what a postmenopausal woman might lose over a decade of osteoporosis. After 1 year, the loss reaches 20% or more. The calcium released from the dissolving bone enters the bloodstream, increasing the risk of kidney stones, a painful and potentially mission-ending condition. Several astronauts have developed kidney stones during or shortly after spaceflight, a direct consequence of hypercalcemia. Exercise does not prevent this loss. Astronauts aboard the ISS exercise for 2 to 3 hours every day using resistance devices and treadmills. Despite this effort, bone loss continues, though at a slightly reduced rate. The reason is that exercise and microgravity cannot replicate the type of loading that bone requires. On Earth, running generates impact forces several times body weight. In space, even with a harness pulling an astronaut down against a treadmill, the peak forces are far lower. The bone responds accordingly. The recovery process after returning to Earth is slow and incomplete. Studies tracking astronauts for years after long-duration missions have found that bone density in the hips and spine does not return to pre-flight levels. Some astronauts retain a permanent deficit of 5 to 10%, even after 3 years of recovery. The implications for a multi-year mission are clear. An astronaut departing for Mars with normal bone density might return with skeletal fragility equivalent to advanced osteoporosis, a condition that increases fracture risk and may never fully resolve. The specific bones that lose density are not random. The femur, the largest bone in the body, loses density most rapidly because it normally bears the greatest load. The trabecular bone, the spongy interior network that provides structural support, thins and weakens. The cortical bone, the dense outer shell, becomes more porous. These changes are visible in high-resolution CT scans and can be quantified down to the microstructural level. The trabeculae, the tiny struts of bone that form the internal scaffolding, decrease in number and thickness. The remaining trabeculae become disconnected, reducing the bone's ability to distribute mechanical stress. What this means in practical terms is that a bone that appears only moderately weakened on a standard bone density scan may be far more fragile than the numbers suggest. The microarchitecture, the internal arrangement of bone tissue, deteriorates in ways that standard scans do not capture. Astronauts who have lost significant bone density are at risk not just of fractures from falls, but from routine activities. A sudden movement, a misstep, even a strong muscle contraction could cause a bone to crack. On Earth, a fractured hip or vertebra is a medical emergency that requires immediate surgery and months of rehabilitation. In space, particularly during a Mars mission, such an injury would be catastrophic. There is no operating room, no orthopedic surgeon, no imaging equipment beyond basic X-rays. A crew member with a fractured femur would be immobilized, in severe pain, and dependent on others for survival. The mission would likely have to be aborted, if such a thing were even possible given the orbital mechanics and fuel constraints of interplanetary travel. Muscle atrophy follows a similar trajectory. In the absence of resistance, muscles waste away. Astronauts lose approximately 20% of their muscle mass during a 6-month mission, despite rigorous exercise. The loss is most severe in the anti-gravity muscles, the calves, quadriceps, and lower back, which on Earth work constantly to maintain posture. In space, they are largely idle. Muscle protein is broken down faster than it is synthesized, and the body excretes the nitrogen waste in urine. The process is measurable in real time through biomarkers in blood and urine samples collected aboard the ISS. Unlike bone, muscle can regenerate relatively quickly upon return to gravity, but the weakening during flight poses immediate risks. If an emergency occurs, a crew member too weak to move quickly, to operate manual controls, or to assist an injured colleague could jeopardize the entire mission. Physical capability is not a secondary concern in space. It is a survival requirement. The type of muscle that atrophies most rapidly is slow-twitch fiber, the kind responsible for endurance and sustained activity. Fast-twitch fiber, used for short bursts of power, is somewhat more resistant but still declines. The result is that astronauts lose not just strength but stamina. Tasks that would be routine on Earth become exhausting in space, not because of the microgravity itself, but because the muscles needed to perform those tasks have weakened. Muscle loss also affects the respiratory system. The diaphragm and intercostal muscles, which control breathing, weaken in microgravity. On Earth, these muscles must work against gravity to expand the chest cavity and draw air into the lungs. In space, breathing requires less effort, and the muscles adapt by atrophying. This has measurable consequences. Astronauts' lung capacity decreases, and their ability to perform strenuous physical work declines. During an emergency that requires rapid movement or manual labor, an astronaut with weakened respiratory muscles may find themselves gasping for breath, unable to sustain the effort required. Then there is the spine. In microgravity, the spine elongates. Without the compressive force of gravity, the intervertebral discs, which are made of cartilage and fluid, expand. Astronauts typically grow between 3 and 5 centimeters taller during the first weeks in space. This is not a comfortable process. Many astronauts report severe back pain during the initial adjustment period. The pain arises because the ligaments and muscles surrounding the spine are suddenly stretched beyond their normal range. But the expansion is not the primary problem. The problem is what happens when gravity is restored. Upon return to Earth, the spine compresses rapidly, and the discs, which have weakened during the mission, are more susceptible to herniation. Studies have found that astronauts have a 4-fold increased risk of herniated discs compared to the general population, a risk that persists for years after their last spaceflight. A herniated disc in deep space, far from medical intervention, could leave a crew member incapacitated with no possibility of surgical relief. The mechanics of spinal elongation are straightforward. Each intervertebral disc acts like a pressurized cushion. On Earth, body weight compresses these discs, squeezing fluid out into the surrounding tissue and reducing their thickness. Over the course of a day, a person can lose up to 2 centimeters of height simply from this compression. At night, when lying down, the discs rehydrate and expand, restoring height. In microgravity, there is no compression, so the discs remain fully hydrated and expanded at all times. This constant expansion stretches the ligaments that hold the vertebrae in alignment. The ligamentum flavum, which runs along the back of the spinal column, and the anterior and posterior longitudinal ligaments, which run along the front and back of the vertebral bodies, are all pulled taut. The muscles that normally support the spine, the erector spinae and the multifidus, are no longer needed to resist gravity and begin to atrophy. The combination of stretched ligaments and weakened muscles leaves the spine unstable. When an astronaut returns to Earth, the spine must suddenly bear weight again, but the supporting structures are compromised. The discs, which have been expanded for months, are softer and more pliable than normal. The nucleus pulposus, the gel-like center of each disc, can more easily push through the annulus fibrosus, the tough outer ring, causing a herniation. If the herniated material presses on a nerve root, the result is pain, numbness, or weakness in the legs, a condition known as sciatica. In severe cases, the herniation can compress the spinal cord itself, causing paralysis. The 4-fold increase in herniated disc risk among astronauts is not a small effect. It translates to a significant probability that any astronaut who spends months in space will experience chronic back problems later in life. For a Mars mission, where the crew would spend 18 months in microgravity during the transit phases, the risk would be even higher. A herniation occurring during the return journey, when the crew is still months from Earth, would leave the affected astronaut in constant pain with no treatment available beyond pain medication. The immune system also weakens. Research on astronauts has documented a decline in the function of T cells, the white blood cells responsible for attacking infected cells and tumors. The exact mechanism is not fully understood, but the effect is measurable. Dormant viruses, such as the varicella-zoster virus that causes chickenpox and shingles, reactivate in astronauts at higher rates than on Earth. Salivary samples collected during spaceflight have detected viral shedding in more than half of crew members, even those with no symptoms. The reactivation indicates that the immune system is under stress and failing to suppress latent infections. The reason for immune suppression in space is likely multifactorial. Microgravity affects the distribution of immune cells throughout the body. On Earth, immune cells circulate through the bloodstream and lymphatic system, patrolling for pathogens. In microgravity, the fluid shifts that send blood rushing to the upper body also alter the distribution of these cells. Some tissues become overloaded with immune cells, while others are deprived. This imbalance reduces the overall efficiency of the immune response. Stress hormones also play a role. Astronauts experience elevated levels of cortisol, a hormone released in response to physical and psychological stress. Cortisol suppresses immune function by inhibiting the production of cytokines, the signaling molecules that coordinate the immune response. Chronic elevation of cortisol, which occurs during long-duration spaceflight, leads to chronic immune suppression. Wound healing is also impaired. Experiments aboard the ISS have shown that skin cells grow more slowly in microgravity, and the inflammatory response to injury is dysregulated. A simple cut that would heal in days on Earth might take weeks in space. An infection that would be minor on the ground could become life-threatening without the ability to mount a proper immune response. The confined environment of a spacecraft exacerbates the problem. Bacteria and fungi thrive in the warm, humid interior of the ISS. Air samples have detected elevated levels of Staphylococcus aureus, Aspergillus, and other opportunistic pathogens. Some of these microbes have been found to be more virulent in space, developing thicker cell walls and increased resistance to antibiotics. The combination of a weakened immune system and a pathogen-rich environment creates a dangerous situation. There have been documented cases of astronauts developing infections during spaceflight. Urinary tract infections, respiratory infections, and skin infections have all occurred. In each case, the astronaut was treated with antibiotics from the onboard medical kit, and the infection resolved. But these incidents occurred in low Earth orbit, where communication with doctors on the ground is instantaneous and resupply of medical supplies is possible. On a Mars mission, an infection that does not respond to the available antibiotics could become fatal. The psychological toll of illness in space should not be underestimated. An astronaut who falls seriously ill becomes a burden on the rest of the crew. Resources must be diverted to care for them. Mission objectives may have to be delayed or abandoned. The sick crew member, aware of the strain they are placing on others, may experience guilt and depression, further complicating their recovery. Sleep disruption compounds every other physiological problem. Astronauts aboard the ISS experience a sunrise every 90 minutes as the station orbits Earth. The rapid cycling of light and dark confuses the circadian rhythm, the internal biological clock that regulates sleep, hormone release, and cellular repair. Sleep studies using actigraphy, a method that tracks movement to infer sleep quality, have found that astronauts average less than 6 hours of sleep per night in space, compared to 7 to 8 hours on Earth. The sleep they do get is fragmented and less restorative. Chronic sleep deprivation impairs cognitive function, slows reaction times, and reduces the ability to manage stress. It also suppresses immune function and disrupts glucose metabolism, increasing the risk of insulin resistance. These are not minor inconveniences. They are compounding failures that degrade the body's ability to cope with every other challenge space presents. The architecture of sleep itself changes in space. Studies using electroencephalography, which measures brain wave activity, have shown that astronauts spend less time in slow-wave sleep, the deepest and most restorative stage. This is the stage during which the brain consolidates memories, clears metabolic waste, and repairs cellular damage. Reduced slow-wave sleep means the brain is not recovering fully from the demands of the day. The causes of sleep disruption in space are multiple. The light-dark cycle is one factor, but not the only one. Noise is another. The ISS is a constantly humming machine, with fans, pumps, and ventilation systems running 24 hours a day. Earplugs help, but they do not eliminate the problem. The confined sleeping quarters, small fabric-lined compartments roughly the size of a phone booth, offer little privacy or comfort. Astronauts sleep in sleeping bags attached to the wall, with no mattress and no pillow. The absence of a down direction means there is no natural sleeping position. Some astronauts report feeling disoriented or claustrophobic. The psychological stress of spaceflight also interferes with sleep. Knowing that you are in a hostile environment, that a single malfunction could be fatal, that you are isolated from family and friends, creates a baseline level of anxiety that makes deep relaxation difficult. Many astronauts report that their minds race at night, replaying the day's tasks or worrying about upcoming challenges. The consequences of chronic sleep deprivation accumulate over time. After weeks or months of insufficient sleep, cognitive performance declines measurably, reaction times slow, attention lapses become more frequent, memory encoding and retrieval are impaired, decision-making becomes more impulsive and less rational. These effects have been documented in ground-based studies of sleep deprivation and confirmed in astronauts through cognitive testing before, during, and after spaceflight. On a Mars mission, where the crew will be operating with increasing autonomy and facing complex, high-stakes decisions, impaired cognitive function is a serious risk. A mistake made due to fatigue, a critical detail overlooked, a miscommunication between crew members, could have catastrophic consequences. The margin for error in space is zero. The psychological dimension is no less measurable. Isolation, confinement, and the knowledge that rescue is impossible create a mental burden that every astronaut must manage. Studies of long-duration missions have identified predictable psychological phases. The initial weeks are often characterized by excitement and high morale. This is followed by a period of monotony and interpersonal tension, typically occurring around the midpoint of the mission. Conflicts over minor issues, such as cleanliness or noise, can escalate in an environment where escape is not an option. NASA and other space agencies conduct extensive psychological screening and training, but no amount of preparation can eliminate the inherent stress of confinement. Research conducted in analog environments, such as Antarctica research stations and underwater habitats, has shown that even highly trained individuals experience depression, anxiety, and cognitive decline during extended isolation. The confined environment of a spacecraft, with no natural variation in scenery, no weather, and no privacy, amplifies these effects. Communication delays add another layer of difficulty. On the ISS, astronauts can speak with mission control and their families in real time, but a crew traveling to Mars would experience communication delays of up to 22 minutes each way, depending on the planet's positions. A conversation becomes impossible. A question sent to Earth receives an answer 44 minutes later, by which time the situation may have changed. The crew must operate with increasing autonomy, making decisions without the guidance or reassurance that real-time communication provides. The psychological effects of this isolation are not abstract. They have been measured in cortisol levels, sleep disturbances, and performance on cognitive tests. A crew member suffering from depression or impaired judgment poses a risk not only to themselves but to the entire mission. Interpersonal conflict in space is inevitable. Studies of long-duration missions and analog environments have consistently found that tensions between crew members increase over time. The sources of conflict are often trivial. Someone chews too loudly, someone doesn't clean up after themselves, someone talks too much or not enough. In a normal environment, these irritations would be minor. In a confined space where the same small group of people see each other every day for months or years, they become magnified. The lack of privacy exacerbates the problem. On the ISS, crew members have small personal compartments for sleeping, but most of the time they are in shared spaces. There is no opportunity to get away, to take a walk, to have time alone. Every interaction is public. Every mood is visible. The crew becomes intimately familiar with each other's habits, quirks, and flaws. Over time, this familiarity can breed resentment. Cultural differences add another dimension. International missions bring together crew members from different countries, speaking different languages, with different communication styles and cultural norms. What one person considers direct and efficient, another might perceive as rude. What one person sees as friendly, another might view as intrusive. These misunderstandings can escalate if not managed carefully. Space agencies are aware of these challenges and have developed protocols to mitigate them. Crew members receive training in conflict resolution, cultural sensitivity, and stress management. Schedules are designed to include personal time and opportunities for private communication with family. Psychological support is available through regular check-ins with ground-based psychologists. But these measures are band-aids on a fundamental problem. Humans are social animals who require space, variety, and autonomy. A spacecraft provides none of these. There have been documented cases of serious interpersonal conflict during spaceflight. During one long-duration mission aboard the Mir space station, tensions between crew members became so severe that they stopped speaking to each other except when necessary for operations. On another mission, a crew member became so stressed and irritable that the rest of the crew asked mission control to send them home early. These incidents did not result in mission failure, but they illustrate the psychological fragility of even highly trained astronauts. On a Mars mission, where communication delays make real-time support from psychologists impossible, the crew would have to resolve conflicts on their own. If tensions escalate to the point where crew members refuse to cooperate, the mission could be jeopardized. In an extreme case, a crew member experiencing a psychological breakdown could pose a danger to themselves or others. The spacecraft carries sedatives and restraints for such a scenario, but using them would represent a catastrophic failure of crew cohesion. All of these factors, radiation, cardiovascular decline, bone loss, muscle atrophy, immune suppression, sleep deprivation, and psychological stress, do not act in isolation. They interact and amplify one another. Radiation damages cells that are already stressed by fluid shifts and reduced immune function. Bone loss increases fracture risk in a body weakened by muscle atrophy. Sleep deprivation impairs the cognitive capacity needed to manage the constant low-level emergencies that characterize spaceflight. Psychological stress elevates cortisol, which further suppresses the immune system and interferes with bone remodeling. The human body is a system, and like any system, it has points of failure. Remove one component, and the others must compensate. But if multiple components are degraded simultaneously, the system's ability to compensate is overwhelmed. This is what happens in space. Every physiological system is pushed beyond its normal operating range, and the cumulative burden eventually exceeds the body's capacity to adapt. The question of maximum distance, then, is not determined by a single limit but by the convergence of multiple declining systems. The human body is not designed for space. It is designed for Earth, for one gravity, for a protective atmosphere and magnetic field, for a 24-hour day, for social contact and environmental diversity. Every hour spent beyond Earth's environment is an hour spent in a state of controlled deterioration. The Apollo missions succeeded because they were brief. The longest, Apollo 17, lasted 12 days. The crew absorbed radiation, lost bone density, experienced cardiovascular changes, and reported visual disturbances, but the duration was short enough that recovery was straightforward. None of the Apollo astronauts experienced permanent disability as a direct result of their lunar missions, though some have developed health issues in the decades since that may be related to radiation exposure. The ISS pushes the boundary further. Missions of 6 months to 1 year are now routine, and the data accumulated over 2 decades of continuous habitation has given us a detailed picture of what the body endures. But the ISS is still inside Earth's magnetosphere, still close enough for evacuation, still resupplied every few months. The longest continuous stay on the ISS was 437 days, completed by NASA astronaut Frank Rubio in 2023. He returned to Earth weakened but functional, though his recovery required extensive physical therapy. A journey to Mars is categorically different. The round trip, including time spent on the Martian surface, would last approximately 2.5 years. During the transit phases, roughly 18 months in total, the crew would be beyond any help, exposed to the full intensity of cosmic radiation, with no gravity, no escape, and no resupply. The Martian surface offers partial gravity, about 38% of Earth's, which might slow bone and muscle loss, but it does not eliminate it. The atmosphere is negligible, providing no protection from radiation. The crew would live inside habitats, confined, isolated, and entirely dependent on systems that cannot fail. The physiological toll of such a mission can be estimated from existing data. Radiation exposure would approach or exceed the 1 sievert career limit. Bone density in the hips and spine could decline by 30 to 40%, far beyond the threshold for osteoporosis. Muscle mass would be severely reduced, and cardiovascular function would be compromised to a degree that might prevent the crew from standing unassisted upon return to Earth. Vision changes, immune suppression, and psychological stress would be guaranteed. Some of these effects might be irreversible. This does not mean a Mars mission is impossible, but it does mean the crew would return damaged. The question is whether that damage is acceptable, a question that science alone cannot answer. What we can say with certainty is that the human body, in its current form, is not well suited for the journey. Every system would be pushed to its limits, and some would fail. Beyond Mars, the constraints tighten further. The outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, are vastly more distant. A mission to Jupiter's moons, such as Europa, would require at least 5 to 6 years. Radiation near Jupiter is orders of magnitude higher than in interplanetary space due to the planet's intense magnetic field, which traps and accelerates charged particles into belts far more lethal than Earth's Van Allen belts. Probes sent to orbit Jupiter, such as Juno, are heavily shielded and follow trajectories designed to minimize time in the radiation belts, yet their electronics still degrade rapidly. A human crew could not survive prolonged exposure to that environment. The radiation environment at Jupiter is so extreme that it serves as a natural barrier to human exploration. The innermost Galilean moon, Io, orbits within the most intense part of Jupiter's radiation belts. The radiation dose on Io's surface is approximately 36 sieverts per day. A human standing on Io without shielding would receive a lethal dose in less than an hour. Even Europa, which orbits further out, receives approximately 5.4 sieverts per day, enough to cause acute radiation sickness within hours and death within days. Shielding against this level of radiation is theoretically possible but practically challenging. Effective shielding requires either massive thickness of material or the use of active magnetic deflection systems, either of which has been tested at the scale required for a crewed spacecraft. The mass penalty of adding sufficient shielding would dramatically increase the fuel requirements for the mission, potentially making it infeasible with current propulsion technology. Even if shielding could be made adequate, the duration alone would be prohibitive. Bone loss after 6 years in microgravity would leave the skeleton unable to support body weight under any significant gravity. The cardiovascular system might fail to recover. Radiation exposure, even with shielding, would be many times the lethal threshold. No existing technology, no exercise regimen, no pharmaceutical intervention can prevent these outcomes. They are the consequence of biology encountering an environment it was never meant to inhabit. Saturn is even more distant, requiring a mission duration of at least 7 to 8 years. Uranus and Neptune, the ice giants of the outer solar system, are so far away that a human mission would take 15 years or more. At these timescales, the question is not whether the crew would survive, but whether they would still be recognizably human upon return. Research on the effects of extremely long-duration isolation provides some insight. The longest single spaceflight ever completed was Valery Polyakov's 437-day mission, but there have been longer periods of isolation in other contexts. Antarctic researchers have spent multiple consecutive winters at research stations, enduring months of darkness and complete isolation. Submariners have spent months underwater without surfacing. These experiences provide data on the psychological and physiological effects of prolonged confinement, though they do not include the added stressors of microgravity and radiation. The data from these analog environments is sobering. Even with rotation of personnel, access to varied food, and the knowledge that rescue is theoretically possible, individuals experience significant psychological strain. Depression is common. Sleep disturbances are nearly universal. Interpersonal conflicts are frequent. Some individuals develop symptoms of psychosis, including paranoia and hallucinations, though these are rare and typically resolve after the isolation ends. The difference for a multi-year space mission is that the isolation would be absolute, and the environment far more hostile. There would be no rotation of personnel, no resupply of fresh food, no possibility of evacuation. The crew would know from the outset that they are committed to the full duration of the mission. This knowledge, the certainty that there is no escape, would weigh on them constantly. Interstellar distances are beyond consideration entirely, not for lack of propulsion, but because the human lifespan is finite and the body cannot be preserved in a functional state for the decades or centuries such journeys would require. The nearest star system, Alpha Centauri, is 4.37 light-years away. With current propulsion technology, a spacecraft traveling at the maximum speed achieved by any human-made object, roughly 70 kilometers per second, would take more than 18,000 years to reach it. Even with speculative future technologies that might achieve a significant fraction of light speed, the journey would take decades. Proposals for hibernation or suspended animation remain speculative. No mammal has ever been revived after years of frozen stasis without catastrophic cellular damage. The laws of thermodynamics and the chemistry of ice formation dictate that freezing causes rupture of cell membranes and denaturation of proteins. Water, which makes up roughly 60% of the human body, expands when it freezes. Ice crystals form inside cells, puncturing the delicate membranes that separate the cell's interior from the surrounding environment. When the cell is thawed, these membranes do not spontaneously repair. The cell contents leak out, and the cell dies. Current cryopreservation techniques work only on small samples of tissue, not entire organisms, and even then require rapid freezing and warming that would be impossible to achieve in a human body. The few organisms that can survive freezing, such as certain species of frogs and insects, do so by producing antifreeze proteins that prevent ice crystal formation. Humans do not produce such proteins, and introducing them artificially would require genetic modification on a scale far beyond current capabilities. Induced hypothermia, a technique used in medicine to slow metabolism and protect the brain during surgery, can reduce body temperature by a few degrees for a few hours. But this is not hibernation. The patient is unconscious, their metabolism is slowed, but they are not in a state of suspended animation. They still require oxygen, their heart still beats, and cellular processes continue, just at a reduced rate. Prolonging this state for days or weeks would require continuous life support, and would result in complications such as blood clots, infections, and organ failure. Some researchers have investigated the possibility of using pharmacological agents to induce a hibernation-like state. Certain animals, such as bears and ground squirrels, enter torpor, a state of reduced metabolism and body temperature, for months at a time. They do so by altering the activity of specific neurons in the hypothalamus, the region of the brain that regulates body temperature and circadian rhythms. In theory, similar mechanisms might be triggered in humans using drugs or electrical stimulation, but hibernating animals are not inactive. Their metabolism slows, but it does not stop. They still consume stored body fat, they still produce metabolic waste, and they still require periodic arousals to urinate and defrost their extremities. A human in a similar state would still need life support, food, and waste management. More importantly, hibernation in animals evolved over millions of years to cope with seasonal food scarcity. Humans have no such evolutionary adaptation, and inducing torpor artificially would require overcoming countless physiological obstacles. The conclusion is inescapable. The maximum distance the human body can endure in space is not defined by the edge of the solar system or the nearest star. It is defined by the point at which the accumulated damage to bone, muscle, cardiovascular, immune, and neurological systems becomes irreversible or fatal. Current evidence suggests that this point lies somewhere beyond low Earth orbit but well short of the outer solar system. A Mars mission represents the practical limit of human endurance with current biology and technology. Missions beyond Mars would require not just better engineering, but a fundamental transformation of human physiology. A transformation we do not yet know how to achieve. There are efforts underway to mitigate some of these constraints. Artificial gravity, generated by rotating a spacecraft, could in principle prevent bone loss and cardiovascular decline. The concept is sound, based on the principle that centripetal acceleration can mimic the effects of gravity. However, no spacecraft has ever tested this at the scale required for human habitation. Engineering challenges include the structural stresses of rotation, the need for a large radius to avoid disorienting Coriolis forces, and the energy required to spin and stabilize the system. These are solvable problems, but they remain unsolved. The physics of artificial gravity are straightforward. A rotating cylinder or torus creates an outward force on objects inside it. An astronaut standing on the inner surface would experience this force as a substitute for gravity. The magnitude of the force depends on the radius of rotation and the rotational velocity. A larger radius allows for a slower rotation rate, which reduces the Coriolis effect, the apparent deflection of moving objects caused by the rotation. The Coriolis effect is a significant concern. In a small, rapidly rotating spacecraft, moving your head or walking in the direction of rotation would create disorienting sensations. Studies of human tolerance to rotating environments have found that rotation rates above 2 revolutions per minute cause nausea and disorientation in most people. To keep the rotation rate below this threshold while generating 1 full gravity, the radius of the spacecraft would need to be at least 224 meters. This is far larger than any spacecraft ever built. Building such a structure in space would require assembling it in orbit, a complex and expensive undertaking. The structure would need to be balanced precisely to avoid wobbling, which would create varying gravity across different sections. The joints and bearings would need to be designed to operate smoothly for years without maintenance, as any malfunction could cause the rotation to become unstable. There are also questions about the biological effectiveness of artificial gravity. Would the body respond to centripetal acceleration the same way it responds to Earth's gravity? Some experiments suggest that the answer is yes, but the data is limited. Ground-based centrifuges have been used to study the effects of varying gravity levels on humans, and these studies have found that partial gravity, such as the 38% experienced on Mars, is better than no gravity, but not as good as full gravity. Bone loss is reduced but not eliminated. Cardiovascular function is partially maintained but still declines. Pharmaceutical interventions are also under investigation. Bisphosphonates, drugs used to treat osteoporosis on Earth, have been tested in space and show some ability to slow bone loss, but they do not prevent it. These drugs work by inhibiting osteoclast activity, the cells that break down bone. By slowing the breakdown process, they reduce the net loss of bone mass. However, they do not stimulate new bone formation, so they are a partial solution at best. Other drugs being investigated include parathyroid hormone analogs, which stimulate osteoblast activity and promote bone formation. In clinical trials on Earth, these drugs have been shown to increase bone density in patients with osteoporosis. Whether they would be effective in space, where the fundamental problem is the absence of mechanical loading, is unclear. Research into countermeasures for radiation damage has explored antioxidants and compounds that promote DNA repair, but none have proven effective against the high-energy particles encountered in deep space. The damage caused by a single iron nucleus traveling at 90% the speed of light is catastrophic at the cellular level, and no drug can prevent a direct hit. Antioxidants might reduce the secondary damage caused by free radicals produced in the wake of a high-energy particle, but they cannot stop the primary damage. Some researchers are investigating radioprotective compounds, chemicals that make cells more resistant to radiation damage. One such compound, amifostine, has been used to protect healthy tissue during cancer radiotherapy. It works by scavenging free radicals and promoting DNA repair. However, it has significant side effects, including nausea, low blood pressure, and fatigue, which would be problematic on a long-duration spaceflight. Moreover, its effectiveness against the types of radiation encountered in deep space is unproven. Genetic modification offers theoretical possibilities. If human cells could be engineered to repair radiation damage more efficiently, or if bone cells could be made to resist microgravity-induced atrophy, the limits might shift. Research in this area is in its infancy. Scientists have identified genes in tardigrades, microscopic animals that can survive extreme radiation and desiccation, that might confer radiation resistance if introduced into human cells. But translating this into a practical therapy would require decades of research and raise profound ethical questions. The reality is that the human body, as it exists now, is adapted to one very specific environment. That environment is the surface of Earth, under one gravity, beneath an atmosphere and magnetic field, with access to food, water, and a biosphere shaped by 4 billion years of evolution. Space is not a hostile environment, it is an absent one. It lacks everything the body needs to function, and the body responds by failing, slowly and predictably. The astronauts who have ventured into space have done so knowing these risks. They have accepted the damage, the discomfort, and the uncertainty because the pursuit of knowledge and the expansion of human capability demands it. The data they have provided, through their bodies and their experiences, has defined the boundaries of what is possible. The maximum distance the human body can endure in space is not a fixed number. It is a function of time, environment, and the cumulative burden of damage. For missions measured in weeks, the limit extends to the moon and back, as demonstrated by the Apollo program. The crew experiences radiation, bone loss, cardiovascular changes, and psychological stress, but the effects are temporary and recoverable. For missions measured in months, the limit extends to low Earth orbit, as demonstrated by the ISS program. Astronauts lose bone density, muscle mass, and cardiovascular function. They experience vision changes, immune suppression, and sleep disruption. But with proper exercise, medical monitoring, and a controlled return to gravity, most of these effects can be reversed over time. For missions measured in years, the limit extends, tentatively and at great cost, to Mars. The crew would absorb a career's worth of radiation, lose a third or more of their bone density, and experience cardiovascular decline that might take years to reverse, if it reverses at all. Vision changes might be permanent. The psychological toll of isolation and confinement would be severe. But the mission is possible, in the sense that the crew would likely survive the journey and return to Earth alive, though damaged. Beyond Mars, the body breaks. The bones crumble, the heart weakens, the immune system fails, and the mind struggles under isolation and the knowledge that there is no return, no rescue, no second chance. The universe is vast, but the human body is fragile. The distance it can travel is not determined by the fuel in the rocket or the power of the engine. It is determined by the limits of flesh and blood, limits we have measured, documented, and cannot yet overcome. This is not a limitation to mourn. It is a reality to understand. Every boundary in science is an invitation to precision, to ask not whether we can go farther, but how far we can go and what it will cost. The data gives us the answer. A human can survive a few weeks beyond Earth's magnetosphere with manageable damage. A human can survive 6 months to a year in low Earth orbit with significant but reversible damage. A human might survive a 2.5-year mission to Mars, but would return with damage that may be permanent. Beyond that, the accumulated burden exceeds the body's capacity to recover. The decision of whether that cost is worth paying is not one that science can make, but it is one that depends entirely on the science we have gathered. The astronauts who flew to the moon knew they were taking risks. The astronauts who will one day fly to Mars will know the same. They will know that their bones will weaken, that their hearts will shrink, that their eyes may change in ways that cannot be fixed. They will know that the journey will leave them damaged in ways both visible and invisible, and they will go anyway, because the drive to explore, to push beyond the known, is as fundamental to human nature as the biology that constrains us. The maximum distance is not a wall. It is a gradient, a slope of increasing damage and decreasing probability of survival. We can push farther, but only by accepting greater costs. We can develop new technologies, new countermeasures, new ways of protecting the body from the environment of space. But we cannot change the fundamental fact that the human body evolved for Earth and Earth alone. If you appreciate this kind of clear, evidence-driven explanation, subscribing and liking the video helps more of this content reach the right audience. You'll also find many other videos on the channel that follow the same approach. The universe is vast, and the questions it poses are endless. But the answers we seek are written in the evidence, measured in the data, and grounded in the reality of what we can observe and verify. The human body can endure only so much, and the data tells us exactly how much. That is the only path to understanding what is true and what is possible.